All right, let's jump right in. We all want what's best for our kids, right? It's a no-brainer. And when you think about something like childcare, you naturally assume that following every single rule, to the letter, has to equal the best possible quality. But what if chasing that kind of perfection actually gets in the way of what really matters? We're going to dig into some fascinating research today that flips that whole idea on its head.
So, to get our heads around this, we're going to start with a really old story, a classic fable actually. It's about a father, his son, and their donkey. Now I know, it sounds pretty simple, but stick with me because it perfectly captures the hidden problem with trying to follow every single rule all the time.
So in the story, right, this father and son are walking along, and they keep changing what they're doing based on what every single passerby says. The boy should ride, so the son gets on. Then someone else says, no, the father should ride, so they swap. Then, you should both ride. And pretty soon, to try and please literally everyone, they end up carrying the donkey. Their attempt to be perfectly compliant with every suggestion leads to this completely ridiculous result. Just picture that for a second.
Okay, now let's connect that back to the real world. The gut assumption, especially for something as important as childcare, is that more rules followed equals better care. A facility that hits 100% compliance, checking every single box, well, that must be the safest, best place for our kids. It just feels so logical, doesn't it? But is it actually true?
This saying just nails what the researchers started to see. They noticed that the staff at these perfectly compliant childcare centers were spending a huge amount of their time just on paperwork, dotting every I, crossing every T. They were so busy wrestling with these compliance alligators that they had less time for the main goal, actually working with teachers and improving the experience for the kids. And that observation led to a huge question. If perfect, 100% compliance creates this massive administrative burden, does it at least give us that top-tier quality we're aiming for? Well, the answer, pretty shockingly, was no. And this brings us to something called the compliance paradox.
You know, for decades, nobody really questioned the more is better idea. It just seemed obvious. But once researchers started gathering and sifting through big sets of data from childcare centers, this really surprising pattern started to pop out, and it turned the whole assumption upside down. And this is what the data showed. It's fascinating. Of course, when a program goes from low compliance up to a high level, quality goes up. That makes sense. But look at what happens at the very end. The leap from substantial compliance to full, 100% compliance, quality doesn't just level off, it actually dips a little. The best outcomes weren't in the places with perfect scores, but in the ones that were almost perfect.
So, this is the key term we need to know: substantial compliance. This is the sweet spot. It's that point where programs are following pretty much all the rules, especially the really important ones, but they aren't so bogged down chasing that final 1 or 2% that they end up sacrificing time and energy that could have gone into coaching teachers or improving the curriculum. You can imagine, this discovery was a massive moment. It basically meant that the entire system for licensing and evaluation, which was built on this idea of getting to 100%, was probably flawed. The takeaway wasn't about being less strict, it was about being smarter.
Okay, so if chasing every last rule isn't the best way, then what is? The next logical question is, well, which rules actually matter the most? And this leads us to a much smarter way of doing things, moving from just brute force to a more focused strategy.
The solution they came up with is a system called differential monitoring. Instead of treating all, say, 300 regulations as equally important, this approach gets that some rules are just way more critical to a child's health and safety than others. It's really all about working smarter, not just harder. So how does it actually work? Well, it's built on two really clever ideas. First, you have key indicators. Think of these as the canaries in the coal mine. If a center is following these specific rules, there's a really high chance they're following most of the others too. Then second, you have risk assessment. This part zeroes in on the rules where if you break them, a kid could get hurt. Things like proper supervision, hazardous materials, or transportation safety. And the result of this targeted approach? It is incredibly efficient. Studies showed that reviews using this differential monitoring model take about half the time of a traditional check every single box review. And that frees up everybody, the regulators, the program staff, to focus their limited time and resources on the stuff that makes the biggest difference.
But you know, a smarter monitoring strategy isn't enough on its own if you're still using an old-fashioned report card to measure success. The traditional way of scoring things just couldn't capture the details of this new approach. It was time to rethink the scorecards.
See, the old system was totally binary. You were either compliant or you weren't, a simple yes or no. That's what's called nominal data. The new way uses something called ordinal data. Think of it like a scale, from 1 to 7. This lets you see the nuance. Instead of just pass/fail, you can actually see degrees of quality, from inadequate all the way up to excellent. And that's way more useful for actually tracking real improvement.
The issue with that old binary system wasn't just that it was imprecise, it was actually dangerous. It led to two big kinds of errors. You had false positives, where a perfectly good program gets dinged for something minor. But way more scary are the false negatives. That's where an inspector misses a really serious problem because the rigid system didn't point them toward the highest risk areas. A targeted, scaled approach helps cut down on those dangerous oversights.
All right, let's pull all this together. What does this shift really mean for how we think about rules and quality and safety? It's a pretty fundamental change in mindset, really. It's about moving beyond just simple box checking.
And this quote just gets right to the heart of it. The debate should never just be a political back and forth between more regulation and deregulation. The real productive conversation is about effectiveness. It's about finding the rules that genuinely protect kids and boost quality, and then enforcing those like crazy, while not getting lost in the weeds with rules that just create more paperwork.
At the end of the day, this entire shift in thinking is about one single thing: getting the best possible outcomes for children. By focusing on that sweet spot of substantial compliance and using smart tools like differential monitoring, agencies can put their energy where it actually works. It makes regulations a powerful tool for getting better, not just a bureaucratic hoop to jump through.
And that kind of leaves us with a final thought, right? We've been talking about childcare, but this whole idea, this gap between perfect compliance and real quality, it's everywhere. You see it in workplaces and schools, even in the personal goals we set for ourselves. So the question is, where else in our lives are we carrying the donkey when we should really just be focused on getting where we need to go?